We're very glad to be here, and I'm very glad to be pretending to be an early modernist for a day, or to talk about an early modern text, since a new project that I'm just starting on has to do with medieval Jewish marriage, and hopefully a social history of medieval Jewish marriage in northern France and Germany. And one of the things I've discovered as I've been trying to teach this material over the past 2 years is that there's very little to use if you want to reconstruct the marriage ritual in medieval Ashkenaz. So one of the things I've done as part of my teaching is I've been turning more and more to early modern sources, and I've been trying to work backwards from the early modern sources to try to see if I can tease out hints from the sources that do exist as to the marriage ritual during the medieval period. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to discuss one source, which is by far the most detailed and rich source concerning the early modern marriage ceremony, and I'd like to discuss it in two different perspectives. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our author very briefly. Then I'd like to provide a slightly earlier perspective to the medieval period, what exists then, and try to explain what I think is new and early modern about the text in front of us, and in Jewish terms. And then I'd like to discuss this text very briefly in comparison to what's going on in Christian society, where I'll need a lot of help from all the participants here, but the impression I've had so far, and then open the floor for discussion. So that's what I'd like to do now. So the text in front of us is the very long description of the marriage custom written by Rabbi Yuspa Shamash, who lived in Worms during the 17th century. Yuspa, as he was known by everyone, or Rabbi Yiftach, was born in Fulda in 1623, and as part of his studies, he moved to Worms when he was 19 to study with one of the known rabbis in the community. If his personal history can tell us anything, he was married at age 21, and I'm relating here to some of the issues we heard yesterday discussing marriage age. And he married one of the prominent women in the community. He became the synagogue's shamash. He became the community's shamash. He was the one who called people to prayer, organized things in the synagogue. He also was a prolific author, or was a well-known author of the community. He wrote the Maaseh Nisim, which told the history of the Worms community, and he also wrote his very elaborate custom book, his minhagim book, which is a wonderful source for social history and for religious history and custom for the period. And his source was rewritten. The source that we're looking at today was rewritten a number of times, since he edited himself a number of times. So the fullest manuscript on which what you read is based is from the mid-17th century. It was written between 1648 and 1658, but this was amended and added to later on by him in his life, so some of those comments are reflected in the footnotes that you see and in some of the explanations that you have. So that is Rabbi Yuspa, who is the author of our text. And I should also just say at the very outset that this text is prescriptive. In other words, he tells what should be done, not what is actually done. So any hinting to what's actually going on in the community is something we'll have to try to figure out ourselves as we read the text, if we can, or we can at least see what's bothering him or what he's stressing, and try to figure out what some of the problems he's dealing with are. And this text is very elaborate in detail. And here I'd like to talk a little bit about what this text has and doesn't have in comparison to what exists before it. So those of you who read through the text and had time to read through all the details must have noticed that this wedding ritual is very elaborate. It takes a very long time. We have here a description of about 30 days, which takes many, many pages. In the printed version, you wouldn't have gotten only 12 single-space pages. You would have gotten more like 60 single-space pages with footnotes and comments, etc. And he goes into minute details concerning what people should be wearing, what people should be eating, what order they should be going into rooms and coming out of rooms, where they should be standing, how much they should be dancing, what time they should be leaving, how they should be doing their hair. I mean, he really goes into the most intimate details. And here I'd like to say something about what isn't here. And the text I'd like to compare this to is a text you don't have in front of you, because I knew that in a 15-minute introduction you couldn't talk about two texts, but I would like to say something about this text very briefly. The only text I can compare Yuspa to is a 13th century text, written by Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda Rokeach, who in his sefer Rokeach does describe the wedding ritual. And when he describes the wedding ritual, he does so in less than 2 pages, just a comparison. In other words, that's the first thing I should say. He does it in less than 2 pages, and he does it in 5 separate sections. 3 out of those 5 sections concern the legal and halachic details of marriage. In other words, what the man should be doing, what the woman should be doing, what blessings should be recited, what the rabbi should be doing, what time this should happen at. Only 2 of those very small sections, of those 2 small pages, concern customs, in which he does mention 6 different customs, all of which are mentioned in Yuspa's text in different ways, but each custom he mentions in one sentence, and then he brings a proof from the Bible, from the Talmud, from some other source to say that this is why we do the custom, and if you look at the Bible, you can see it says, usually a source that doesn't really help explain the custom, but he brings some source from the Bible to try to explain why they're doing what they're doing. So if we look from the 13th century to the 17th century, we can see that we have a tremendous elaboration of marriage custom, but even more than that. Yuspa's text, if you read carefully, contains almost no detail as to the halachic process of marriage. He doesn't even mention what the 7 blessings one is supposed to say at the wedding is. In other words, he's so concerned with how society should be conducting itself that he's either assuming that people know what they're supposed to be doing, or figuring that someone there will always be able to tell them. But when he's writing these things down for his community to remember and to perform, he's not even bringing those very important details, which every textbook before brought. So you don't think that I didn't do my homework. I have checked through the books from the 13th century to the 17th century, and while there are other authors who describe the wedding custom, perhaps the most extensive one is the Maharil, Rabbi Yaakov Mali, Ben Moshe Mali. He also brings many more halachic details than he does details concerning the customs. So what I think we have here is a new phenomenon, that what Rabbi Yuspa thinks is important is all these small processional details that have to do with how society should be conducting itself around marriage. So that's one thing I think here is very new compared to what we have from the medieval period. This isn't to say that all customs are new. That's not what I'm trying to argue. What I'm arguing is that the emphasis that Yuspa is putting on these customs is new. There's a good chance that many of these customs existed before, and I just started by saying that one of the reasons I'm interested in this text is to try to go back to earlier texts and to see what I can find in earlier texts that does hint to these things. And that is also a place to say that this text that we have in front of us is part of a fairly new genre. The minhag book, the books of customs, are an early modern phenomenon that early modern authors saw fit to give their communities, whether they did so because they thought their communities couldn't study the legal sources themselves as they had in the past and they needed some kind of guide, whether it's part of early modern phenomena of guidebooks or of manuals that we can see in many different areas. And in Ashkenaz, at least, we know that the earliest manuals have to do first with circumcision. Manuals for circumcisers are among the earliest we have. Then we have manuals that have to do with the rules of ritual purity, written for men, but meant for them to use to help monitor their wives. And the sefer minhagim really fit into this phenomenon. So one of the new things we can see here really is this detail and the lack of halachic instruction, which we've seen in books before. So that is one change from the Middle Ages that I'd like to point to. The second thing I'd like to emphasize has to do with how to compare this text to what's going on around the Jews in the early modern Christian society. Now, as someone who, in my work, I like to do a lot of comparative research between the Jewish community and the Christian community, I would say that we should look at marriage as something that the Jews certainly see as an internal process. There is no way that a Jew would be marrying a non-Jew and having a Jewish wedding, of course, so the Jews certainly see marriage as a very internal business. It's something that's going on between Jews within the Jewish community, and even if, as we'll hear later today, we have Christians who are coming to view the process of marriage and to see what Jews are doing, this is still viewed as an internal Jewish affair. Why am I saying this at the outset? I would at least suppose or hypothesize that this means that Jews feel like what's going on within their wedding ceremonies is very Jewish, even if it's something they're adapting from the outside. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that it almost makes it easier to adapt elements they see around them because there's no fear of someone saying to them, well, you're really doing something very Christian, because they can't be doing something very Christian. They're doing this within the Jewish area, within the Jewish jurisdiction, and also within the Jewish community. And I think one of the most important things that I saw in this text that emphasizes that is that Jews seem to be doing an awful lot in the synagogue, or in the different buildings around the synagogue. In other words, everything here is so tied into the Jewish authorities and to the Jewish places that I don't think they would have to fear so much if they were adapting and adopting many elements from around them. And that, of course, leads to the second thing I'm about to say, which is that so much of what's going on here, the braiding of the hair, the different head coverings, the processions, the feasts, the dancing, the music, the entertainment, is so similar to what Christians are doing in their marriage ceremonies around them. And when I first started studying this text, the article that immediately jumped up every time I looked to try to understand more about early modern marriage was Lyndall Roper's important article in Past and Present, Going to Church and Street, Weddings in Reformation Augsburg. And I think that the title of that article is even enough for us to start discussing this text with, Going to Church and Street. One of the things that Roper argues in the article is that no less important than what was happening within the church, in the official Christian setting for the wedding, what was happening on the street was as important, if not more important in many cases, in order to ensure this couple's status in the eyes of society. And I think we can really read Yuspa's text in light of this comment of going to church and street, and see what's happening here within Jewish society, in the Jewish street, happening within the Jewish street. And just to give you some basis for the comparison, I'm just going to read a very, very short few lines from the article in which he describes the marriage process in 16th-century Augsburg. And she says as follows. Townsfolk seem to have regarded marriage as being created through the progression of a ritual cycle, in which the participation of kin and parents, not just the couple themselves, was extremely important. The first step occurred when a formal proposal was made by the man or his representatives to the bride's parents. We don't have that in Yuspa because Yuspa doesn't start with the proposal. He really starts with the marriage about to take place. If accepted, arrangements concerning property and inheritance between the couple were agreed, and a week or so later, a formal engagement took place. From this point on, the couple were known as bride and groom. There followed a period of several weeks or months, during which preparations for the wedding were begun and parties held in honor of the couple. The wedding itself was spread over several days of feasting and dancing, and the ceremony of exchanging vows at the church door, or the blessing of the bride and bridal mass, might not necessarily be the most important moment in becoming married in the eyes of the community. Now, I wouldn't argue that this is correct line to line for the Jewish ceremony, and certainly within the Jewish community, the act of becoming man and wife was a very, very important act. And of course, the days of feasting have many more ancient bases within Jewish community, but I think that this description of this long process of marriage in which the street and the community take such an extensive part is really very correct for what's going on here. And as I said, if you compare it to the medieval text, it's much more elaborate than anything we can see before. So, if we set out to read this text with this background, I just would like to point to two more points that I found very interesting in this text before I open the floor for discussion. So the first point I would like to point to is the ordering of the young people in this text. I think what this text reflects within the early modern context is an attempt to control how the young people are behaving from 2 points of view. I see the control as, first of all, teaching them what their place is. In other words, they're being taught through this ritual how they're supposed to behave in society. They're being taught where they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to do at each point, and what the appropriate place for them is. And if you read through this text carefully, you can see how the young boys are instructed where to sit, when to drink, when to dance. I almost felt to me the first time I read the text is that this is when they're being given the first chance to drink liquor. And the liquor is being given out in a very specific way, and each one gets a certain amount. In other words, we have control of the young men and of their habits when they're becoming men, of these young adults who are becoming men. And so the control is to teach them what they're supposed to be doing on the one hand, how they can be men and drink liquor, if we'd like to take that as an example. At the same time, it's also saying this is when you're supposed to be doing the drinking. You're not supposed to be doing the drinking outside of the community, outside the watching eyes of the fathers and the mothers who are watching over you. So you can see socialization of these young people. At the same time, if you compare what the men are doing to what the young women are doing, you can see some other very interesting things happening here from a gender point of view. The young men are being welcomed in as part of the male community. And on these different events, in different ways, in each of these different meals, they're being told you can be part of the male group of society. You can be part of the adult men in society. The young women are being taught what their place is in society at the same time. If those of you who read the text, you could see that when they went to congratulate the bride and the groom on that Friday night before their marriage, when they went to the groom's house, the groom would sit at a table filled with beautiful things to reflect his status, and he was eating and drinking together with his friends. When they went to the bride's house, I don't know how many of you noticed this as you read through the text, the bride was sitting at a beautiful table decorated with all these beautiful things and beautiful food, and she was not allowed to eat. Not only was she not allowed to eat, but at a certain point in the text it says that she and her friends sit there in great modesty and silence. They're not supposed to be talking. So we have a lot of passivity being taught to these young women through these rituals. And at the same time, we can see this passivity reflected in what their mothers are doing, because Yuspa is instructing these women to stand by the door, not to say anything, only to go in with their husbands when their husbands go in, sometimes not to eat as well. So we can see at least what Yuspa had hoped these women, young and older, would be doing. So we can really see in this text a way to order society, control society. People come into the bride and groom's house according to their importance, according to their rank. And we can also see important gender differences reflected in this ordering society. So I really read this text as a way to try to arrange society. And I think in light of some of the research that I've read on early modern Europe and on youth in early modern Europe, we can see an attempt of parental control of children these ages, an attempt that perhaps does not always succeed. We can't tell that from this text, but we know from other texts that this attempt does not always succeed, but we can see Yuspa doing his very best to try to explain to the community how they should be controlling their young ones, so their young ones grow up properly and they don't rebel against their parents' wishes or against the behavior that's expected from them. So I think that's one thing we can see here very well in this text. The other point that's fascinating in this text, and I'd love to discuss today, if someone could help me expand on it, is the clothing. The clothing, this elaborate clothing that these young men and women wear. Now, the men's clothing can be explained somewhat as part of ritual process, religious ritual process, I would say. The religious ritual process being whether it's mourning and remembering the temple, or trying to ward off the evil eye, so tricking the devil into thinking not that he's a groom, but that he's someone who's mourning. I mean, these are things that we're familiar with from earlier periods, and we see very strongly in the early modern texts that I'm familiar with. But the men's dress seems to be important, but it's not as elaborate as what the women are doing. These young women are changing head coverings and braiding their hair and letting their hair loose so many different times during this event. And I think that this also fits in to the perspective I was trying to provide just a moment ago of ordering society. This young woman is learning how she has to cover her head when she goes out of the house, when she can take off certain covers, what she's supposed to be doing, how she's supposed to look as a good city woman during this period. But I think we also see a tremendous reflection of wealth, and if not of wealth, of the importance of material goods in the society, that each of these young women is receiving these elaborate clothing. And some people have tried to argue through Yuspa's book, and I'm not sure I agree with this, it's just an aside, that Yuspa's text reflects the wealth of the Worms community, the Worms Jewish community during this period. I don't know to what extent we can learn that from his text and say that every single Jewish member of the community was this wealthy, but it certainly reflects an expectation that each of the members of this community would be able to have these elaborate clothing, and I guess alteration was made when this wasn't possible. But I think that's also a very fascinating point made in this text, the importance of outward appearance and what this outward appearance seems to say about your standing in society, about who you are, about your place, and about where you should be. So I would like to open the floor now for discussion with these few perspectives, and I'll just summarize what I tried to say again. First is the early modern change that I've tried to suggest here, and what I find very interesting from the Jewish point of view, ignoring the halachic details, ignoring the ritual procession details, but concentrating so much on these other less religious rituals that seem to come across here. The second thing that I pointed to was the comparison to Christian society, what's going on among the Christian members of the city in Worms who are getting married, to what extent this could be seen as similar or dissimilar to what's happening. And then I pointed to 2 points within the text. One was the elaborate dress and what that can tell us about the society. And the second was this ordering society, and I especially suggested the ordering of the youth that we can see here, that I found really very interesting. So, thank you. And now I open the floor for discussion.
I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that topic of similarities with Christian practices. I haven't read the whole text. Maybe if you could offer a couple of what you consider to be salient examples of that. And also, perhaps say something about your idea as to the perception of, on the one hand you say it's safe to do so because it's considered to be an internal process and ritual and part of the Jewish community, but there had to be some sense of perception of the other in terms of the sharing of customs and the way in which they are or are not different with respect to such ritual.
Okay, it's easier for me to start with the second.
Yeah.
So I'll start with the second just because that's something that I do in my work all the time. And then I'll bring specific examples which maybe can illustrate what I'm trying to suggest here. I think when we talk about comparison and what seems similar and dissimilar to people in a different time, it's always very difficult because, of course, what we see as similar or dissimilar can be very different from what people who view us from the outside see as similar and dissimilar. What I would say here is that because the ritual is Jewish, and it's clear that these people, it's so clear that he doesn't even need to say it. He says, then they say the Shabbat before, he doesn't even need to explain what they are. And it's clear that these people are going through the Jewish ritual. We're talking about two Jewish people who are getting married. That seems to be the essence. So it's a Jewish wedding. If the bride is wearing the same thing as a non-Jewish bride is wearing at that time, that wouldn't seem to be something that bothers people. The same way it doesn't bother the most ultra-Orthodox today to have their brides wearing the same clothing that non-Jewish brides are wearing, maybe with the correct modest corrections made to the bridal gown. But I mean, where did that white dress come from? So, from the point of view of the clothing, if I'm talking about clothing, I think that would be something that would be very similar, and to me seems to be very interesting, but would be almost obvious that that's something that would bother people. What I think is more interesting here is things like the braiding of the young woman's hair. So, if you look there in the middle of this, you can see, I think, a wonderful example of the similarity and dissimilarity. Because the shamash calls everyone to come for, and afterwards the sexton calls Vikala Flechtim Gen, and then the rabbanit, the wife of the rabbi, comes first to the home of the bride and commences with this mitzvah to braid her hair. Now I'm just going to stop in that sentence because I think that sentence almost says it all. What's going on here? I mean, I found out from Lyndall Roper that the same braiding of the hair went on, especially if the woman was a virgin. If she wasn't a virgin, then her hair was braided, was not braided, it was done differently. So if we look here, what do we have? We have a braiding of the hair. This is a shared value in both society. The virginity of this bride who's about to be married, the sexual honor of this couple, and that this man receives the right kind of wife. But you can see here how Jewish this has become. In other words, the fact that the society around is doing the same thing doesn't even make a difference anymore because the rabbanit comes first. The rabbi's wife comes first, and she does it. And not only does she do it, she's doing a mitzvah. And we can see how Yuspa changes these actions into very Jewish things. And once again, I'm not saying that the woman's hair was not braided earlier, although I have no evidence of her hair being braided in any medieval text that I've read. But it could be that her hair was braided in the same way. Perhaps art, illuminations can show us the same things, although, of course, art is very difficult because sometimes they were drawn by a Christian artist, so it's very hard to know what's really reflecting what happened in Jewish society. But I think this is a wonderful example where he turns this into a mitzvah. In other words, these details of getting ready for the wedding and going through this ritual become mitzvot. They become ritual, they become commandments. And as such, they become very Jewish, and it doesn't really matter if that's what people around you are doing. Who are these musicians who are playing music on Shabbat at these weddings? They clearly were not Jewish musicians. They were Christians who were hired. So why should we expect that the music was so different from music that was played at a regular Christian wedding? I mean, all of these things make the wedding, at least in my eyes, to be very similar to what's going on around, but of course with this very Jewish content coming into it.
And we also have, if you look at the church legislation of Christians prohibiting attending Jewish weddings, so it clearly is a communal affair, even though you say the rituals are Jewish or Judaized in some ways, you do have Christian presence, at least in the feasting. Maybe not in the, inside the synagogue and in the ceremony, but at least in the feasting.
So that only adds to it because it's something that the whole community would be seeing as an accepted right.
But I think you have to see that the Worms community is living in a ghetto. And I think it's very difficult to say if there are connections between Jews and non-Jews. And I think it's important to see the situation, perhaps, of the Worms community in this time. And there's a research project in Germany on Worms in the early modern times, in the frame of German Gedeik, is a great research project since the early Middle Ages. And maybe he's claiming an ideal situation for the Worms community, and maybe the Worms community is in a crisis in this time. I don't know. But I think it's very good to see the context of the history of the community in this period.
No, I agree, and I think the fact that the Jews do live in a ghetto in this time, but we have to think, what does this mean that they live in a ghetto? There's been a lot of interesting research done over the past years of what does this mean, this ghetto. It doesn't mean that they were closed off to their surroundings. They certainly saw what went on in other parts of the city, and other parts of the city saw what went on within the area that the Jews lived in.
But they are living in a very different situation, comparing it with other communities in Germany in that time. And other communities are really living together with Christians, and they are not allowed to live in this way.
They can't make a marriage like that.
But no one can make a marriage like that. In any case, no matter what community they're living in. I'm not talking about a marriage with Christians. That's what I said at the outset. This is impossible. This cannot be happening here. What I do think is important, and I think it's also important in research that's done on early modern marriage, not in Jewish communities, in Germany that I've read, is that each community has its own minhag. Each community has its own way of doing things. And Yuspa says that again and again throughout his book. He says this is the way we do it in Worms. In other places they do it differently. Each community has its own way of doing things. One of the things that I thought as I read this text is that, of course, people from Worms don't always marry people from Worms. In other words, they're certainly marrying people from outside of Worms. So this is the way the marriage takes place when it's happening in Worms. And he's expecting people who are coming from outside of Worms to adopt his minhag. And it's very clear, even when he talks about the house of the bride. Let's say the bride came from outside of the city, or the house of the groom. He says either his or her parents or whoever is standing in for them. In other words, it's obvious that they don't always have their parents. It's not just because they might be orphans, which of course might be the case as well, but it's also because they might not be in their own home. They might not be in their place. But he's expecting them when they come into Worms to adopt his minhag. And I think what's really interesting is how important it is to him that the minhag, to the detail, be known and be adopted. At least it's very important to him. And it's very important to people who follow him because this book is widely cited and it's widely used, not just in our time, by people who studied early modern Germany, but also by people who lived in generations after him. So I think that's a very interesting point about the text.
Yes, I think also, but one more point is when I read the text, I thought it's socially completely indifferent. And you spoke on clothing. And clothing is something which makes a difference, a social difference. And so it's very interesting that he doesn't make differences. And then I thought, what might this, the importance of this text be? And one of the similarities to Christian practices might be to write down minhags, such a minhag. Because after 1648 it was fashion in Germany for Christian to write all the rules and customs down. It was the feeling of losing death of many people, but also it was discussed in history. Although some people of the elite, some elites tried to reinstall order. So what he writes down may be his vision of a society, of a Jewish society, and so his vision of gender rules. And I think that could be, you could make it a little more important that he has wrote in this situation all many Germans wrote customs down.
Thank you very much. And that just reinforces this ordering that he's trying to
reinstall, to reconstruct, and to construct order. I think they were inventing such rules in this situation. I could do it to invent a rule who was perhaps very traditional, gender separated, and all these things.
And what relation does that have to reality in the German text that you're familiar with? Almost none.
They tried to use the German texts in trials to get right the Weistümer and all these all texts have been written down in the 1650s, 60s. There's not much research done on it, but there are many texts written down.
That's wonderful because that also explains his difference to the people who came before him,
yes,
and tremendous detail that he wants to put in here in his way of writing. His descriptions are, I would say that they stand up to other descriptions we have from other places, but only to part of it. Here's the only really whole description we have. And other descriptions, we'll see that in Yasha's presentation of the Jewish ritual that we have from other places, do describe the same rituals that Yuspa has described with slight variations, but he really is the first who feels the need to write it down in this way, and you've just provided me with the key
Yes, and also what Birgit said, I'm not sure about Worms in 1648. I'm sure that the 30 years war was very, very heavy.
Yes.
And perhaps there were many new Jews coming, and you have a chance to install a new law.
Or precisely the opposite, it's the need to reinforce the diluted minhagim that are because of the unrest.
Right, and Yuspa does mention that himself in some of his autobiographical comments. He mentions the 30 Years' War. He mentions things that happened to him and his family and different problems in the community. So that certainly is a context in which he is writing what he's writing. Most of the people who have written about the Minhag book, there have been 5 or 6 articles written over the year about the Minhag book, have not put such an emphasis on these events. They just kind of said, well, he mentioned the 30 Years' War, he mentioned these things, but I think that what you're saying now is certainly something that needs to be done much more. In other words, to try to contextualize what he's saying even more within the events around him and not just treat them as something that he mentions in his narrative. So thank you very much.
When we talk about acculturation and a certain degree of making it Jewish, and that's the theme that I've dealt with, and I learned it years ago from Nahum Sarna talking about even the biblical period. Question, though, is what's the direction of acculturation? We always kind of begin with an unspoken assumption that the Jews are taking in and perhaps Judaizing, in quotation marks, what's going on. And the question would be, could it perhaps be the other way around? I suspect sometimes in Rome it is the other way around. That sometimes it's one way, sometimes it's another way. It's the second question I would ask here, because with this myriad of detail, I didn't pull it out. What's the order of the marriage ceremony here? What's the order? And of course, he's just dealing with the marriage itself. He's not dealing with engagement to marriage. In Rome, they get engaged, whatever the engagement is, sometimes called elusim, but Chaim Soloveitchik always tells me it has no halachic standing, so it's loose. And they immediately have the kiddushin 3 weeks later, but they don't have the chuppah, the actual matrimonium. The kiddushin being the notze. The notze is the chuppah. The matrimonium is the kiddushin. That occurs, and then you have 6 months to a year to the actual chuppah and the actual beginning to live here. What's going on here? Because I know there are medieval debates, and of course there's Freiman's old work, which are clearly going way beyond and elaborating. A third point, which is unrelated, when you were talking about this is the first time they're getting liquor, and talking about forming the community, it sort of becomes like the exploiting the wedding ceremony as a communal rite de passage of some kind, for a group rite de passage, a way of integrating all the youth into the community by undergoing the ceremony and all of the elements of the rite. So these are just some observations.
Okay, so the first question, I think I would say that my assumption is usually that the Jews of the minority culture are seeing what's going on around and adapting that. But I would say that word is even too strong for me. I think they just are living their lives and they see what's going on and that becomes part of their lives. If we have to point to it,
I didn't say it that. I said taking in.
Or taking in, or acculturating, or whatever the word we want to use. I don't want to use any of them to a certain extent. I used it now more as part of my presentation just to present these things, but I think we could just say that this is part of their lives, it's the way they do things. I don't think they think twice about it. Certainly not when it has to do with the clothing or the food or anything of that sort. So I think from that point of view, we don't have to work quite so hard here and think about the direction. This is what's going on in 17th century Worms. This is what people are wearing. These are the cloths these are the cloths they have at their disposal, the materials they have at their disposal. This is what they're doing. And I think we can see that the fashion is more or less the same. Italy is very interesting from that point of view. From the point of view of fashion, I don't know enough about early modern German fashion, at least from my medieval impressions and the work I've done in clothing in the medieval period. I can see that the clothing is more or less the same. I spent about 3 weeks of my life once trying to analyze the head coverings women wore in a 13th century depiction of a circumcision ceremony and trying to figure out if that's like what Christian women were wearing to church. Of course, it was not a very good project. It took me a lot of time to figure out that I shouldn't be pursuing this much further. But I can say that from my brief impressions of those 3 weeks, they were pretty much the same. And the women were dressed in the high style of the time in Regensburg, which is the city from which this specific illustration came from. So from that point of view, I wouldn't work quite so hard here, and I don't think that the point I was trying to make is that in order to understand what the Jews are doing here, we really have to know what's going on in the Christian society around them, not because we're Christianizing or Judaizing the ritual here, so much as because we're really seeing what early modern life is about. And although the Jews are in a ghetto, and although the Jews are living separately, I don't think they're that separate. I don't think that what's happening here is separate. I think they're part of the German city from that point of view, and they know what's going on. So I find it very hard to separate them to such an extent, perhaps because I'm a medievalist and I'm not in the right early modern frame of mind, and here I stand corrected. But I really see this as part of one social milieu. So that would be the first thing. What's the order of what's going on here? From what I know, the Kiddushin and Nisuin took place together. This is the custom from the 13th and 14th century in Germany, and this is what's happening here as well. We do have here the betrothal, the Erusin, and we do have the question of what this betrothal is, but they don't recite any brachot here. It's just a mazal tov.
The first paragraph refers to betrothal.
Yeah. Yes, it does. Yes, certainly it does.
It's on page 9, and it seems like he's just using it as a synonym for kiddushin. I mean, that's my first reading of it.
I don't think this is kiddushin. I think this is.
Well, he's talking about.
It's Erusin. It says Erusin.
I know it says Erusin, but it says who officiates at the kiddushin, then goes to Erusin, then goes back to kiddushin. It's as though because the bracha, except somebody remember the exact bracha. The bracha uses the word Erusin.
But this is not kiddushin. They say the bracha the kiddushin at the chuppah. They say all the brachot together.
Right.
At least from what I know, this is just the agreement that they'll be married and the ta'im. The vessel is broken.
Which page?
I'm in the very, very first page. Page 1, 227.
I was on 9.
No, then you're already deep into this ritual. You're already after the Shabbat Chatan, and you're already deep in the ritual.
I move fast.
So it seems that at the very beginning they just have this agreement, which is parallel to the Erusin. You are right that from a halachic perspective, it shouldn't be binding, but we know from the Middle Ages that sometimes it was binding in different ways. It certainly was binding socially. In other words, the breaking off of this Erusin was considered a very, very grave thing to do, and sometimes it even required some form of divorce. It really depends where. And the last comment you made, I think, I completely agree with what you said. I do think they're exploiting the wedding ritual and the wedding ceremony here to do so much more within society. I think that's what happens through rituals. I think that's what is so interesting about rituals, and that's why it's so fascinating to study them. In other words, that they are using this wedding ceremony, this engagement of this couple and the process they're going through, and that's what I said, to teach people in society their place in society, where they should be, what the order of things should be. And I think the young people especially are being educated in this way. There's another comment from Yuspa someplace else that's fascinated me that I always promise myself that I'll pursue someday, which I can't believe. And this fits in very well with what Claudia just suggested now, which is he says that young women never come to the synagogue until they're married, except for on Purim. That's what he says in a different place in his book, which means that these young women who are getting married, and I didn't say anything about the age of marriage, but I would assume that they are 14 or 15 here, and I'm using, of course, Wilco as my model here, who got married when she was 14, but that seems to be the age for girls. Young men got married a little bit older, 16 or 17, and if they were like Yuspa, a Talmid Chacham, if they were a scholar, often in their early 20s, just like he got married when he was 21. But could this be true, that young girls are not coming to the synagogue until they're 14 or 15, and being such an integral part of the Jewish community? Part of me finds that very hard to believe that they never come except for one day a year. But Yuspa is certainly trying to say, now that you're a married woman, you should be coming to the synagogue, and this is part of what you should be doing. So whether or not it's true that they never came before, it is clear that when he talks about coming to the synagogue after marriage, he's trying to educate them to what their place should be now within Jewish society. And I think that's true about so many other details here, teaching them where they should be, teaching the young men what they should be doing. And perhaps something I didn't say before that I should add in, at the same time as they're trying to order these young men and women here, they're also giving them space. One of the things we should notice in this text is the space they're giving the young men and women to do their thing. They're being given space at the bride house to dance. They're being given space to sit and drink. They're being given space to sing songs to each other and have parties on the nights before the wedding. Very controlled space. No, very controlled. This is very, very controlled space, but I do think we should notice that there is space here. I mean, the word control, I think, is the first word we should say, and that's why it's the first word that I said. But I think as we notice this control, we should also notice the kind of space they're trying to make for these events to take place. So I think that's also very interesting, and I think, Ken, you're right, that they're exploiting this wedding ceremony in every way they can in order to get as much out of the ritual as possible. And once again, we have to remember that these rituals do not happen all that often, so when they do happen, they're really a huge community event. Okay, let's go around.
Related to the issue of space, actually, I was struck by how much of the wedding is actually happening in the streets, and I was wondering if it's also not a way for the community to occupy the urban space. I mean, I sometimes almost felt like I was reading about a Christian procession with people dressed and music
May
going
I add
around.
to the same question? We know about regulations against extravagance in Muslim countries. So exactly, if they went out in processions and ceremonies, was it not forbidden by the Christians?
Maybe someone can help me here. I don't think.
Because in Muslim countries, in the same period, there were communal regulations against extravagance and processions and such things. So it's absolutely different.
Right, there's no element.
There's no.
Here, there's no element of sanctuary.
No, there is none, and that was
striking.
And I mean, people who
Someone
study
commented
Italy,
already
people who
on
study
the
Italy
absence
are
of social differentiation, which is
there is no mention of that here, and I'm not familiar with kakanot against that in the way that we're familiar with it from Italy, let's say, or from other places. But perhaps someone could correct me. Elisheva?
No, but I don't think that the descriptions here contradict the notion of sanctuary laws. When Jews go out into the world, they have to be modest for various reasons when they're amongst themselves. But I do want to add one other thing here. That is that this is a very expensive celebration here. And you didn't pick out, but I would like to, because that sets the stage for what I'm going to do. And the fact that the little dowry pouch changes hands as part of this. This is an economic extravaganza and an economic transaction that only the wealthy could pull off. I mean, when you talk about space, who had space among Jews in the ghetto? So we're talking about probably the highest level of the Jewish community, and you should be aware of that because I'm going to talk about the lowest level.
Yes, I want to follow up on Elisheva, because I think it's a methodological problem. Because we do know from the sumptuary legislation that we have that weddings and the size of the parties and who you can invite are an important form of social regulation. Jay Berkowitz wrote about it for France. Ted did an analysis of some Polish regulations, which is to say that that whole element is just missing here.
No, it's not. If you notice, when they invite people to the party, the person has a tzetzel in which it's written who to call to the party. In other words, not everyone is called to this party.
No,
you
but
can see from
there's
both
no
parties.
restriction on numbers.
We're talking about numbers, not
there's no restriction on numbers.
If you pay this much tax to invite that many people, if you pay this much tax to invite more people.
If you look at section 232, it says on Thursday night, on page 11, on Thursday night, the night after Chuppah, the priest is married. That is what is called korban. They summon relatives and neighbors and severe and no more.
That's only one of the parts. Yeah, no, I noticed it.
I think
no, but I want to take it one stage further, because what it seems to indicate to me is that he's really not interested in the class elements here. He's putting forward a particular vision of what a marriage should be. And then you have to ask the question, first of all, what is the relation between that and the social reality of even the richest people, but let's talk about the poor people. We can sort of imagine to ourselves maybe that poor people wanted a marriage like this, but then again, maybe they didn't. We just don't know. So methodologically, it puts you in front of a problem. What is the relation between this and reality? And it doesn't answer the question, what is the relation between this and the values of the community? And you have to find a way of more closely connecting them before you can take it. It's a brilliant text. But before you can take it and use it for some kind of social history, there's a gap there. I mean, we all face that gap. But my feeling is that if you start working through class, you start trying to see how different classes marry, then maybe you'll get some kind of a way of measuring this up against a different form of reality. Then you can start talking about values and social actions and connecting them together. But as it stands, it's really, I find it really a problematic text.
So if I can respond, I would say that I really don't have the text. I don't have text that will allow me to figure out how people who were not of this class married. These are the texts that I have. Now, these texts are attested to, and I think you'll see them in the text that Yaakov presents soon, in the reports that Christians give about Jewish marriages. In other words, a lot of the detail that's here comes across when Christians come and say, this is what we saw at a Jewish marriage. So I can say that what's happening here is being seen by people who are coming to view marriages. Now, certainly the Christians who are coming to view marriages are not coming to view poor people's marriages. They're not coming to view even middle-class marriages. They're coming to view the most upper class. I have to say that for me as a medievalist, while this is a problem, it doesn't strike me as as big a problem because I always have that problem. In other words, I never have much evidence concerning what people of the lower classes or even the middle classes are doing. I always have this kind of prescriptive literature that I have to go from and try to find out what's happening. Since this is my richest text, I would start from this text and then go from there. I did start by saying this is just the first step. So I agree with you that I do have this gap. This gap is there. I'm not saying that this gap does not exist, but I do think that since this is a text that we have, and we really do not have these other texts that will help us try to kind of beef out this picture here and give us more information, we have to start from here. And I think that Yuspa, as the shamash of the community, who we know from his stories in Maaseh Nisim, is also trying to transfer certain values and try to give certain messages to the community. I think if we read this as part of his authority, and if I'm adding all the very helpful comments that I've received this morning, we do see here how we think society should be ordered. Now, I agree, this is not reality. That's the first thing I said this morning. It's a prescriptive text. This does not reflect reality, not in every detail and not in any other way, although I must say that when I've looked through books about costume, a lot of the different things that he describes here I have seen in 17th century Germany, and I can take some of the different pieces of clothing that he describes here and match them to specific artifacts. So he's not describing something that doesn't exist. He's describing things that exist, of course. But I do think that we can learn from him what his social values are, and we can see at least what his ideal world is. From there, to go to the not ideal world, I mean, that's obvious. There isn't even a word here about how the shidduch was arranged, whether this couple is happy with each other. What do you do when the couple does not want to get married? What do you do when you have last-minute problems? I mean, what do you do when...
That's not his business.
That's not his business. That's not his business in any way. So we don't have any of those social facts that would be part of a true social historical picture. But I do think we have his vision of the ideal marriage, and that does give us a lot concerning the society that he's working on.
There's a word that is, I don't find it in the text, at least not often, if ever, and that's the word should. So whether this text is prescriptive, he doesn't sound like it's prescriptive.
I think can I follow up on you need controls to know what's prescriptive or descriptive.
Well, I want to expand my comment.
Oh, because there are two
beyond.
controls here within it. Go ahead.
One is the language isn't prescriptive. He doesn't say this is what you should do. He said this is what they do, number one. And beyond that, to take that a little bit further, the genre we're talking about is customs genre. Well, that's a pretty flexible term. We found the word mitzvah, you pointed it out, and it doesn't sound like any mitzvah we know. So what's a custom? Now, is it a custom? If it's a custom, then this could be descriptive, not prescriptive. I don't know. If it's a custom, why are they writing it down? This is a question that was discussed here. Are they afraid that some people don't know the custom? Are those people new arrivals? And so the problem of what kind of text this is and what it's for is part of the bigger question of what is this book all about. It's not really a question about marriage ritual per se. It's about what is Yuspa trying to do.
He's a shamash, and in these days a shamash was a kind of ritual memory of the community. And since mine is also a text that comes out of a sexton, a shamash who records whatever happens in this community, I think you're looking at a period in which minhag is very important, but it isn't only rabbis who tend to go from place to place to place, have positions in multiple places, but the shamash of the community who resides in one place often their entire lives become the resident ritual memory for a community, and I think that's what he's trying to lay out here.
I think so too.
But I don't think that, I want to take where David started and continue, and I think that Elisheva is right. I don't think that it's necessarily prescriptive, because there are at least two issues here that are certainly against halakha, and yet the described here is that they should be done. One is the use of non-Jewish musicians on Shabbat, which certainly rabbis in the time were very much against, and they write against it. So clearly, if this was prescriptive in terms of rabbinic text, this wouldn't be here. The other was the consummation of the marriage. The marriage is consummated only after the Sabbath, after the marriage. So if the marriage here takes place on Wednesday night, they don't consummate the marriage until Saturday night. Now that clearly is again something that rabbis at the time were against. So if this was someone coming as a totally prescriptive religious text saying, then those things should be corrected. But instead we follow these two comments, both David and Elisheva. If we have a description of what is happening, this fits in with what you said regarding the Christian community, then it makes perfect sense that he would just describe what is. And he continues. He's not here as a moralist trying to correct the community.
I think he is trying to correct communities in other places where he feels. I mean, I think you're taking the word prescriptive a little bit too far, further than I meant it. So I'd like to just stop this part of the discussion here, at least to give my point of view on it, and also to respond to one of the things that David said. First of all, the word mitzvah. The word mitzvah, the way it's used here, is used at least throughout the medieval text all the time for things that are not mitzvah in any way. And we hear it used in English today among Orthodox communities in the same way. So I don't think we should use this word mitzvah in the same with the word prescriptive, in such a strict way. My children's friends in Philadelphia, where we live, used to say, "Oh, you're doing the biggest mitzvah," when they gave them a candy. I mean, the word mitzvah was used very, very freely. It meant a good deed. So I mean, the fact that they use the word mitzvah, maybe I was wrong in emphasizing it before to such an extent, but the fact that they do a good deed and they call it a mitzvah, I don't think is a mitzvah. Even more so, there are issues that are not halachic that become mitzvah. Classic issue that I'm familiar with is the role of the Baal Brit. The Baal Brit, the person who holds the baby at the circumcision ceremony. Oh, the perfect time ever. The person who holds the baby at the circumcision ceremony is called the Baal Brit. There is no mitzvah any place in the world for someone to hold the baby at the circumcision ceremony. And the medieval texts all say the mitzvah of the person holding the baby is greater than that of the circumciser. Now the circumciser is doing the mitzvah. He's circumcising the baby. So why should the person holding the baby be doing a greater mitzvah than the person who's doing the act of circumcision, which is the mitzvah? So once again, but the medieval texts certainly take this to an extreme, and they see this as a very important role. So I think that when they say mitzvah here, you shouldn't read it quite the way I don't agree with that reading, at least. I wouldn't read it in that way. This is the way that they transform different elements of the ritual into being important elements. And they say these are central elements. And I think we should read this as this is something important. And then if we're trying to read this as a social text, we should say the virginity of this woman, showing her virginity, is very, very important. It's of important social value. Now, I think when I'm reading Yuspa here, I'm not reading him as rabbinic prescriptive. I wasn't trying to say that he's being prescriptive as a rabbi. I'm thinking he's being prescriptive as a communal authority, which means some of the things he's recommending, and I'll get back to the word should in a minute, at least in my eyes, some of the things he's recommending might not be halachic. And we know that they're being done throughout Germany at this period, and rabbis are objecting to them, and they still continue to happen. And until you get a rabbinic figure who's strong enough, or loud enough, or brutal enough, or powerful enough to stand up and say, stop, and put his foot down in the right way, they'll keep on happening. So we'll have the non-Jewish musicians playing on Shabbat, and we'll have the consummation of the marriage on Motzei Shabbat, and we'll even have some authorities who will justify it. In other words, we'll even have some people who say, well, maybe there really is reason for this custom. So when I say he's being prescriptive, he's also being descriptive, certainly. He's not just prescribing this from nowhere. He's talking about things that are happening, but I don't mean he's being prescriptive from a rabbinic point of view. I mean that he's being prescriptive, yes, from a rabbinic point of view, because he is someone who's learned the halachot, and he does see himself as quite an authority. And thank you, Elisheva, for adding what you added, but also that he's saying what the community should be doing, even if some of it is not exactly what halacha straight, if there's such a thing, is recommending. So I agree, but I don't think that we have to take it to there. I still think we can read him as being a prescriptive source.
One last question.
I think sort of that you might help yourself in writing about this by getting away from two sets of binary terms that you're using. We all use in teaching prescriptive and descriptive, and it's as you enter into the early modern world, there are so many more genre out there of literature that you might just drop that and think about coining a new one, like memorative or preservative or some other kind of text, because I think a lot of the comments are trying to point out that there are more complex genres out there. And another is that in your language, one of the set of comments that I'm hearing is reflecting the way you're using the word mitzvah yourself and the way you use the word religious. You are using a binary when you speak casually, which opposes halachic versus halachic and religious as opposed to everything else. And the texts that you're reading and the people that you're talking about aren't doing that. They are not using that binary, as you pointed out. They're not making mitzvah mean halachic. And so it would be more helpful if you could align the way you talk about the texts with what the texts themselves are saying, instead of needing to correct them.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So, thank you. I'm sure we'll continue some more on this.